Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES assists electoral processes very broadly defined across the world, and we have supported elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 19th installment in our series. So far, we've covered issues from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of the Kremlin in European democracy and elections. If you've missed any of our previous discussions, you can find recordings of them on our YouTube channel. My colleague is putting a link to that in the chat. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor and also Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. Corruption remains a significant problem throughout Europe, and it's a major detrimental, impactful event on democracy, on governance, and on the economy. Many different tools are used to counteract corruption, and digital transformation has gained prominence as an anti-corruption tool globally, particularly with respect to public services, as it focuses not just on digitalization, but on cultural, organizational, and on operational change within institutions. However, if digital transformation is not introduced carefully, it can itself become a flashpoint for corruption. So let us examine the evidence and the experience around digital transformation as an anti-corruption tool, talk to prominent experts who have led such processes. I'll start by exploring the broader context of digital transformation and anti-corruption, together with the IFES Senior Global Legal Advisor and Director of the IFES Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust, Katherine Ellena. Then we'll turn to experts who have experienced digital transformation as part of the fight against corruption in different countries. First out will be Hannes Astok, who is Director of the e-Governance Academy in Estonia, and he has also spent many years supporting digital transformation as an anti-corruption tool in Ukraine. And talking of Ukraine, we'll next turn to Oleksandr Starodubstev, who is Deputy Head of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention in Ukraine, and who is in charge of, among other things, digital transformation. And finally, we'll talk to Vladislav Bidikov, who is ICT expert from Computer Center of the Faculty of Computer Science and Engineering, and also a member of the Inter-Governmental ICT Working Group. It's in North Macedonia. After that, we'll open for discussion, for questions to our panelists. If you have any questions, you can already now type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so let me first turn to Katherine Ellena, the IFES Senior Global Legal Advisor and Director of the Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. Katherine, help us out. What does digital transformation really mean?
Sure. Well, thanks, Magnus. And it's a real pleasure to be here talking about this topic because I think it's a real bright spot potentially. And I'm very excited that we have some of our partners from the region who have actually been leading some of these processes. But sure, I think the term digital transformation emerged really from the business sector. And so if you Google online, I think much of what you read will be around digital transformation and business models. But I think it helps to sort of start with what it is not actually, or how it's distinct from other common terms. So I think people often talk about digitization, which is more focused on making information digital. It's not so much focused on processes. And then we talk about digitalization, which does focus on processes, but it's the introduction of digital technologies, essentially, and often to support existing processes. But digital transformation is really looking about the whole problem set, which in this case, different from business, is around corruption. And then the stakeholders who are either part of or impacted by that problem set. And then just fundamentally transforming systems and processes in response. So the focus here is really the end user, essentially the citizen, the individual, and then you work backwards to what needs to change in processes. And so I think there's a focus on different types of transformation, as you said, Magnus. There's obviously process transformation, but also organizational and cultural transformation. And the introduction of digital technologies basically supports those transformational processes. And I think given, this webinar focuses on evidence, and given what we've learned about social norms and corruption, I think that element of cultural transformation is quite important. And not to kind of confuse the mix, but I wanted to throw out just one more term because I think it's important to this discussion. And I think people will hear talk of integrity tech or integrity technology. And this is really the use of digital transformation in a myriad of different ways to basically support integrity writ large. And one key part of this is just smarter use of data analytics, both inside and outside of government. Because the more you have this digital transformation process, potentially the more you have easy access to data. And that can really help with meaningful oversight. Just to give you one example from outside the region, Colombia, the audit office developed an analytics platform that basically took contracting data and triangulated it with company registries to detect anomalies. And that was key at revealing some of these anomalies. So again, data and integrity tech is a core part of this.
Okay, so you explained what digital transformation is. You gave us an example from Colombia, but from your perspective, how can digital transformation be a tool to fight corruption in Europe?
Well, I think it already is, and I'm going to defer to our panelists to really talk about the real potential on the ground. But I think that at the core of most digital transformation in government is the simplification of administrative processes and basically the rationalization of rules and procedures. So getting around red tape, bureaucratic procedure. In theory, that obviously reduces discretion and therefore potential opportunities for things like bribery. This is important because it tackles the types of corruption that perhaps impacts daily lives of people. So trying to access public services, trying to get rid of some of those corruption vulnerabilities there. However, I would also say that there's a potential impact for transnational corruption and bigger forms of grand corruption. So for example, and I sort of talked about one there, algorithms within online tax filing or procurement systems can help to actually flag anomalies that might point towards these much broader corruption schemes. So I think there's a potential benefit here, both with petty corruption and with grander and transnational corruption, which, in the region, I think is, there's an acknowledgement that this is increasingly an issue that needs to be tackled.
So this sounds great. So it sounds like we've sorted corruption then. Maybe it's not quite that easy. We know that corruption is a very difficult area to address. What would you see as the limits of what we can do with digital transformation in relation to fighting corruption?
Right. So, I think there's a real benefit in digital transformation in government as an anti-corruption strategy, partly because it's not called an anti-corruption strategy, right? It has benefits in a broader sense. But of course, I think it would be too simplistic or naive to say that this is a wholesale solution. I think the complexity of corruption, corrupt systems, it can't be resolved by digital transformation alone, but it obviously clearly depends on the institutional and political context. So institutional incentives, state capacity, leadership in the public sector is key. So in order to actually make digital transformation work, you have to focus on the core institutional and political structures at the same time. And then I would also just say that digital transformation can bring new risks, right? And they have to be thought through as a process is being introduced. So for example, if you're introducing a new digital process, you might have a big rise in government technology budgets and procurements. Another thing is if you're going digital, you can expose government perhaps to different types of cybercrime or ransomware. So trying to predict some of those different types of corruption as you're going through this process, I think is really important.
Right, thank you. A final question then. What is IFES doing to help in their fight against corruption in European politics and elections, including through supporting digital transformation?
Well, I think we're doing a lot, but I would love to do more. We work with partners and oversight institutions, including a number of the ones on this call. And as I just said, these institutions are just foundational to these anti-corruption efforts. The other key piece is the relationship between institutions and other actors, such as maybe the media or civil society organizations. And I think that connective tissue can potentially help institutions, but also amplify the benefits of digital transformation. For example, if civil society can use the data that's coming out of some of these processes. So, we're doing a lot, I think, both with institutions and civil society in the region. And I'll just say maybe last thing around IFES, digital transformation, because of the risks we just talked about, needs to be done very carefully. And also in some cases, depending on what it is, underpinned by very sound registries, particularly civil registries, to support how they work with individual citizens. And certainly, IFES has decades of experience, I would say, both with carefully introducing digital technologies in the electoral context specifically, but then also ensuring sound, robust civil voter registries that can underpin these processes. So importantly, this has to be done within long-term relationships with institutions within a country. It's, I would say, not good practice to sort of parachute in and suggest a digital transformation, but rather that be part of a discussion and introduction in a longer term relationship, which I think is how IFES likes to work.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Katherine and Ellena from IFES. Let's now turn to Hannes Astok, Director of the e-Governance Academy in Estonia. So, Hannes, the e-Governance Academy has implemented e-government projects in Ukraine since 2014. I want to ask you two questions in relation to that. First, from your perspective, what have you achieved? What has been the progress? And the second, how do you compare the digital transformation in Estonia with that in Ukraine?
Hannes,
Hannes, I think you are muted, sorry.
Yeah, hello everyone. Now it's much better, I guess. And thanks for inviting me. And I start, if you allow, from the second question. I think Ukraine has used this crisis, the war, what is currently running on, actually very well to use the digital means and digital tools. And I should say that currently the digital online services, what are mainly used by smartphone for Ukrainians, they are really world class, and they are not wasting the crisis. They are really using it, because if you understand well that there is around 6 million refugees who are Ukrainians in other countries, and around 10 million internally displaced people. So you can imagine that smartphone and government application is the only communication what they can actually afford with the government, because in many places citizens cannot go to their homes and government offices are just physically destroyed. So in this sense, it's extremely important, and I'm very proud that Ukrainians managed to build those systems and applications up before the war. So we have been supporting Ukraine from 2014, and we have been focusing on a digital government infrastructure, how to provide services securely to the citizens through online channels. So this means that there should be proper online databases, whether in digital format, there should be secure data exchange, and last but not least, strong digital identity available. and on the top of it, the applications for the citizens and businesses. So we have mainly been concentrating to the back end, especially to the secure data exchange, what is called Trembita. And this is what we supported the implementation in Ukraine during last years. And we really see the really strong kind of impact of those actions to Ukrainian society, because if you move the administrative services from traditional paper-based face-to-face services to the online services, it's actually remarkably reduces the risk of corruption, even most of the cases eliminates it. Because as former Estonian President Toomas Ilves used to say, that it's very hard to bribe a computer. So there is no situation where two persons, one is official and another is citizen or businessman, is sitting in the closed room. It's always the risk of corruption in this situation. But if it's like online communication, no one can ask, no one can provide.
So Hannes, thank you for that. We were looking for practical examples. And you mentioned Trembita, this system for secure data exchange. Can you tell us a little bit more how that may prevent corruption?
Yes. The key issue is that, and as we have a slogan also in Ukraine, that let's make data run, not people. So, so we truly believe that most of our administrative services could be provided online. As we have sample in Estonia, that 99% of public services are available online. Only you cannot register marriage, you cannot register divorce, and you cannot do real estate transactions. And again, also in Estonia, those last 3 remaining services are not because you cannot do it online technically, but this means that marriage is pretty sensitive transaction, we should say, and we need to be sure that those 2 persons who want to marry maybe 3 a.m. are really sure that they want to marry and not are very unhappy about it next morning. And definitely the divorce is even more sensitive case, because you need to split your wealth and you need to split the children and children's rights. So this is very complicated. And also real estate transactions. It's very easily we can transfer them online, but the question is always that, is this person who is selling his property, is it his or her clear will to do it? And for this reason, we need third party like notarius publicus, who actually proves that both sides are willing to do the transaction. And after the notarius actually doing the transaction online. But returning to the case of Ukraine, as said that more this is machine to machine, or basically citizen to machine communication, and less there are actual people, actual officials are involved, there is less corruption risk. This is clear. It's not only providing efficiency for the country, for the government and for the citizens, but also actually reducing the risk, because no one to talk, no one cannot ask bribe, no one cannot provide bribe. This is also culturally should be considered, that it's not only asking the bribe, it's in many cultures it's providing the gift. It's like a cultural issue. So so we truly believe that Ukrainians don't want to provide gifts and bribes. So and they are very eager to use online services. And this is, I think this is one of the reasons, as we have interviewed people also in Ukraine, they said that we don't want to meet officials because when we are in very uncomfortable situation. So this is like a first like feedbacks what we have got from Ukrainian citizens.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Katherine earlier talked about the importance of simplifying communication. I know you are working on a simplification on online services. Can you explain a bit more about what that is and how that relates to corruption?
Yeah. If we are building up online services, there is like a high risk that we are taking the existing paper-based procedure and transferring it to online. So actually this means that we are transferring existing stupid processes to digital stupid processes. So I think we need to avoid it. And the trick is actually that if you can use a lot of existing data sets, what are existing in various databases in the government. You don't need to ask the same questions from the citizens as you usually do when citizens must fulfill the application. What are the main questions? What is your name? What is your date of birth? What is your home address? What is your name of your dog, or whatever they're asking? But the same questions, but actually all this data is stored already in the government databases. Usually in the civic database, there is your name and date of birth and maybe home address. Your properties are listed in the property registry, your businesses are listed in the business register. So actually, if we are properly using the existing data sets for the services, and usually most of the data is existing already. So this is like, first of all, making the use of services for the citizens much more simpler. If I need to update my driving license, basically, I just need to click the button, update my driving license, use the photo from the passport, and this is it, go ahead, but not fulfilling endless applications. And simpler the services is, it's also more people are encouraged to use them online. If you are putting like a 20 questions application form online, no one is willing to fulfill it because you are probably making tens of mistakes. So, and again, when you need to turn to official, and when it's again the risk of when you meet official, there is a high risk of corruption again. To do it faster, to you know, handle your application faster than others or something like this. If you do it online, it's automated, immediate response when everyone is happy, and no need to have face-to-face communication. More transparent transactions. This is what is our lesson.
Thank you, Hannes. And final question. In this discussion series, we have several times addressed the unlawful war by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Given this, how do electronic services support Ukrainians during this time of war from your perspective?
Yeah, I think this is really a survival question for Ukrainians because, as said earlier, the digital government application is probably the only communication what they can have immediately. Also, like in the government application, you have your digital documents available, your passport, your ID card. Also, soon there will be educational certificates and so on, so you can prove them, because many people just run out from their homes without any document. So actually, if you have your smartphone with you, or you can buy the new one and log in again, you have your documents with you, you have your education certificates with you, probably soon also some medical documents. So this is actually saving the lives already in real life.
Thank you very much, Hannes Astok from the E-Governance Academy. And let's continue focus on the use of digital transformation in the fight against corruption, specifically in Ukraine. We'll turn to Oleksandr Starodubstev, who is Deputy Head of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, also known as the NACP, in Ukraine. Oleksandr, why does the NACP consider digital transformation as an important tool for preventing corruption in Ukraine?
Yeah, hi, Magnus. Hi, all. First of all, thank you very much to IFES for inviting me here. And of course, I want to say thank you to all Europeans who support us during this awful war against Russia. And my family is in Europe now. I personally in Kiev, but many families of our employees went to Europe and continue work remotely to find assets of Russian officials to work on our sanction portal. And this is again the benefit of digital transformation. They can stay in Europe and work remotely. Katherine and Hannes already told a lot about the automation of procedures. Usually when people discuss what actually government does, government form policy and execute the policy. And usually the execution is service. Government provides services, and in services you have a lot of opportunities for automation, to make it simpler, to make it digital, to make it clearer, to make it straightforward. What usually doesn't fit to digitalization is forming the policy, what usually humans do, yeah, creating where we are now, what we want to have in 10 years and how to get there. But in this process, in making so-called policy decisions, I want to stress that digitalization is even more critical, because every policy decision should be data-driven. Otherwise, you have so-called expert-based policy decision, and you know that there are many experts, and they all believe in different things. And when you have clear data received from the clear data source, this data is structured, this data is comparable, and you can assess different options, alternatives based on this data, your decisions more clear, more argumented, let's say. And of course, in this regard, we did a lot in National Agency on Corruption Prevention. We have many portals, but maybe the most famous our IT tool is our Declaration of Assets portal, and more than 1 million people, already less than 1 million people every year submit their asset declaration to our registry. And this form is very long and very deep. More than 1,000 fields people fill in these declarations, and of course we receive the huge amount of data. And we have so-called logical arithmetical control, which analyze all this data, which compares this data to the registries where we are connected, government registries, and then signal us, provide us with some red flags where our officers should look first. And of course, you cannot assess and compare and check all these declarations, 1 million declarations, without clever analyzing of this data, which would be totally important without digitalization. Again, maybe my point here is digitalization is not only better paperwork, simplicity, and convenience for common people to receive the services from the government. It's the best source for the best decisions made by the government, because they are data-driven.
Well, thank you for that, Oleksandr, and thank you for mentioning the issue about the asset declaration process, because I'm very interested, just like when we were talking to Hannes earlier, of practical examples. So apart from the asset declaration system, could you give us an example of where a digital solution has reduced corruption or the perception of corruption in Ukraine?
Actually, I would prefer to mention here another example, which is very close to me, which is our public procurement system. It's called Prozoro, which means in Ukrainian like the word transparent. It was my idea after the Revolution of Dignity to create such a system in Ukraine. It was a civil society movement for this digitalization of the public procurement. We did it as volunteers for a year, and then I became the policy maker in this area. And we implemented it in 2 years. And I would say that this system totally opened the full data about public procurement, what was announced, what was the questions and answers during the tendering process, how the auction go on. So all the information became totally open. And of course, we conducted several surveys. Our partners like Transparency International, they conducted several surveys. And of course, the corruption, we could see it in different, usually indirect measures and criteria, that the level of corruption definitely decreased. The problem is that the perception of corruption increased, because now everybody saw the data, and it created many questions why this exactly bridge was constructed in such a sum, etc. But again, from my point of view, the general practice that every digital tool decreases the corruption but increases the perception.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that that's true, and it's something we have to deal with always in fighting against corruption. But if we look at potential challenges, not only in the perception of corruption, but actually in corruption itself, from your perspective, can the introduction of digital tools and processes create new or additional risks for corrupt behavior?
Actually, I agree with Katherine here. The implementation of digital tools need the tendering process. So the IT procurement itself usually is rather complicated, with very difficult tender documentation, and you can bump into corruption in IT procurement itself. But this is probably the only option which I can see, because in all other areas the implementation of digital tools usually decrease the corruption, increase the perception of corruption. But again, if you have so-called BI tools, business intelligence tools, you can educate society, analysts, watchdogs, how to compare procurements between themselves. So even with this perception, you can work with some educational tool, usually BI tools, but this is usually the long story. Anyway, from my point of view, the digital tools decrease corruption in any area, increases the perception, but BI can help with that.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. And let's ask you a final question, going back to the war in Ukraine. How has the war changed the approach by the National Agency for Corruption Prevention regarding the fight against corruption and regarding the role of the agency in the development of Ukraine?
The war changes everything. First of all, we paused right now our anti-corruption activities about the declaration of assets, because of course you cannot declare your assets if you're a refugee in Europe or in Western Ukraine. So of course we paused that. We paused the portal for financial reports for political parties, because again, this is not the first priority. But because we previously had all this IT culture, I would say, this is, as I understand what Katherine was talking about. Our employees from the very beginning of the war reoriented, let's call it, from Ukrainian corruption officials to Russian corruption officials. So in 2 weeks from the beginning of the war, we introduced the sanctions.nazk.gov.ua. This is the portal for personal sanctions for all jurisdictions who implement the sanctions on Russian officials. We coordinate this work. We launched another portal for informing about Russian assets all over the world, because we are hunting right now for Russian assets to stop them, to block them, and then to seize them, to compensate all these huge losses that Russia did during this war. So we were able to switch very quickly from one activity to another activity because we were prepared to that. We had all this IT culture necessary in our organization to work with that. We used many IT tools before that. For example, we used Jira Service Desk for our just service activities in our organization. We used Jira Server for all this Kanban and current planning in our organization. We, by the way, with IFES support, where we are very, very grateful, we right now use Jira, another application of Jira, oh my God, I forgot the name, for the whole institutional strategy. I will remember, I will write it in chat. So before the war, we have so many different IT tools just for our convenient work and collaborating in the office, that it was easy for us to switch from one very important activity to another important activity which is necessary during the war. The summary here is we believe with our head Oleksandr Novikov, head of the NACP, that every organization should implement IT, and every organization is IT organization. Not everybody understands it already. If I'm not wrong, Jeff Bezos said that. But we definitely try to digitalize everything that we work with in our organization and in our work.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr Starodubstev from the National Agency for Corruption Prevention in Ukraine. And finally, let's then talk to Vladislav Bidikov, ICT expert from Computer Center of the Faculty of Computer Science and Engineering and member of the Intergovernmental ICT Working Group in North Macedonia. Vladislav, we talked a lot about digital transformation in general terms and its positive impact. Let's talk about how do you do it? So what do we need? We need money, we need technology, people, all of it.
Hi everyone, and thanks for the pleasure to be involved in this discussion. And thanks Magnus for asking this quite important question, because we have heard in the last year that this digital transformation is a buzzword. And then the famous question arises, how do you do it? And in this case, different people will tell you different parts of the whole idea or the whole concept. And actually you need a few things, as you already mentioned. First, you need the willingness, the political willingness, I should say, and this is the people. You know, people willing to get out of their standard work, generally in the administration, and then to see how to transform things. Then you need to find technology. Usually this is the easiest part because technology is evolving and it's generally available. And then you go to the hard part, and my colleagues already mentioned this via the famous tendering procedures, but it costs money. And then when you have all three, you have to implement it. And the implementation part is actually the teamwork, the willingness of people that need to start the process. Sometimes this process looks at the beginning easy, then it gets hard. But usually at the beginning it looks hard because the first step, the willingness to do the transformation, needs to be solved. And then technology is here, and then you can see that using the right technology, even the amount of money needed can be easily sometimes streamed down to something more appropriate based on the needs of the country, the needs of the institution, etc. But then at the end, again, you return to these famous three things, and then you need to find the people. And when we say people, I'm not talking about the people getting the vendor and getting people into doing your project, but I'm talking about the human capacity inside the government, inside the organization, inside the private company, who then need to actually use the tools and to be part of this digital transformation. And this is usually the most difficult thing, because people need to be built, and this is a process that takes time, usually months and years. And it's important to know that people tend to look and need to believe into this process, because you can't just say, okay, we are now going to digitalize everything. From today, we are doing it like this. People need to be ready, and people need to see your tools for digital transformation, that they are tools they like to use. And this is why you have to have everything. And this concept of having the capacity, people, money, and technology that works in synergy in order to have your process as it should be done.
Okay, so we talk about the process of digital transformation. You mentioned first steps. So I'm interested in starting there. How do we start the process? And should the government in the country go first? Should the industry go first? What's your take on that?
This is a very hard question. And this generally depends from the aspects, the local aspects in the country. If we all hear about the story of Estonia, and here we see that many years ago, the government decided that they will be the first starting point of this process. And then we saw and we heard and we see their successful stories. We only heard only three things which are not digitalized, and they're not part of the digital transformation. But sometimes for other countries, the other part of the story is more interesting. COVID actually showed us that this can start from the industry. We are today on this platform, and after 2.5 years, we're doing these events, and this is now the new normal. We see the similar industry gain from banks which were the, let's say, in many countries, the slowest and most paper-like industries suddenly decided to take this fast train and go into digital transformation and developing tools in order to get close to their end users, because just for a simple reason, because of COVID, their office is closed. So it's difficult to find the answer of what is the best way to do, the government or the industry. I believe personally that it should start with small steps. Small steps both from the government for some services, for services that are simple but have a wide impact of end users, and this is, the citizens. And on the other part, small steps from the industries which have already the IT tools to do this. Banks and other industries like telecom operators are the first subjects which can benefit and help you in this. And then first you start with small tools, with small processes, and then people see this development and they're ready for the bigger projects, because it's very difficult to start this process and be afraid to fail the process. This is why it's important smaller victories in the beginning that will give you the right morale of the people that need to do this process in order to be successful. And usually, both government and some industries like to think big at the beginning, and this is actually one of the risks which can lead to unsuccessful process like this, because you just created a too big story without any plan and without winning some small battles.
Okay. The issue of business processes has been mentioned several times in the discussion so far. Can you talk about the importance of business processes before doing digital transformation?
We heard this business process as a thing in our discussion, and we'll hear it again. And it's always interesting that, and Katherine just mentioned in the beginning very, very vividly, it's how we need to understand that changing a process on paper into a digital process is not the right way to do it. You don't do on part one-to-one what is done on paper now to be done digitally. On the contrary, you need to see the whole ecosystem. Let's take a simple example in the cultural field. Buying or selling tickets for cultural events. This is completely different in the digital transformation world, because you're digitalizing a lot of things. But on the other thing, you need to think about the most important aspect of this when you're doing it on paper, and this is the seating arrangement which is different for the venue or for the type of event you're having. So you have to cleanly think about that. Whatever you know about the standard process, you have to analyze, rethink, and see how do you evolve it into a digital process. And usually in this process, the best way to do is to listen to the people which are involved in the classical process, then see the technology, and then show to them, to these same people, that this tool, this technology can change and improve this process. And this is why it has to be done like that, and it has to be a process. And then you should iterate. Let's say we are doing this once, we get feedback. Okay, we did it good, it's fine. Or maybe we didn't do it as it should be, and now we are rethinking it and optimizing and doing this process again and again and again, because we need to value the importance of this digital transformation. Does it really at the end change things? Does it really in the end provide tools which will stop in-person corruption in a way, or people depending on these in-person meetings? Or we are just declaring that we are doing something, and in the end it's maybe even worse?
Okay, so to pick you up on that, ask you the last question to you, indeed the last question to any of our panelists. I'm interested in the broader impact of digital transformation. Can it produce jobs? Can it make government more efficient? What's your response to that?
This is a very interesting question, and this is actually the scariest question when you're starting digital transformation in the government, because you tend to get the feedback from people which are already involved that this will actually replace them in a way, and this will at the end make them obsolete, and their jobs will be lost. In reality, getting a good process done correctly should improve efficiency, but also require wider set of people and dependencies in order to support these processes. And in real time, and at the end of this process, in a few months or years after that, you will see that you will need more people, more jobs, more specialized jobs connected to what is now the standard process. But of course, the important thing in this is to evaluate that you're supporting more people, more capacity of that institution with the same amount of people which are in the institution, or if you require more people, that actually you will provide more services and make them more efficient. We should understand that in a lot of countries, the administration, although in theory they say they work 7, 6 hours, 5 hours, choose a number, in reality their efficiency is summarized to up to 2 or 3 hours. And a lot of the rest of the time is actually lost to procedures or administrative things which are not part of the main process. And it's just waste of value, time, and in the end, money and efficiency.
Thank you very much, Vladislav. Bidikov. We'll now take questions to our panelists. If you have a question, type that in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And while you are typing away, I'm going to read out some questions that have come in already. One which I would really like to know the answer to, and I'm just reading it out now. How important is the availability and use of data around party financing, interest declarations, lobbying, public consultations, and RTI performance to thwart corruption? And in particular, how do we deal with the lack of interoperability among these data sets? Oleksandr, you kindly typed in an answer to this. Would you like to also talk to us through how you respond to this?
Yeah, actually, I typed already my variant of the answer. You need so-called data warehouse system where you collect all this data, and these systems, I don't know, like Cloudera and others, they allow you to clean this data to create so-called how to say it in English, master data, and according to, then you design your data model and structure all the data according to this data model. And then after you collect and structure and clean all this data, you, as a next step can play with some AI, artificial intelligence system, where you take some narrow nets and neuroscience nets, and these tools can find some unusual cases and show it to officers. So the next step of what we are planning right now in the NACP, we already designed this process, but we understand that probably we'll be able to work with that after the victory in this war. We will implement this data warehouse system and then make our check system even more efficient.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. Someone else want to address this issue? Katherine?
Well, I know you would have strong thoughts on this as well, Magnus, but I particularly liked that the question was asking both the availability and then the use of data around political financing and these other areas. And of course, those two things go together. You know, data has to be made available in a certain way so it's actually useful. But then once it is, there's such a myriad of different uses by different stakeholders that is so important. And I think this is just at the core of political financing in particular. If you can't see the information and digest it appropriately and utilize it, then it's not having the impact we need in terms of firstly identifying maybe corrupt practices in political financing, but then just feeding into educated voter choices that's based on seeing this information. So in terms of use, you know, once it can be made available effectively, you know, effective auditing, I think, as Oleksandr sort of mentioned, and potentially AI and how something is audited and flagged. But then civil society potentially helping monitor and actually provide information that the public can digest. Similarly, maybe journalists being able to take some of the information that's coming out and feeding it back to the public. So I think that it's fundamental, both the how it's made available and then how it's used in a variety of different ways. And that gets back to that comment I made earlier about it's not just for the institution, it's for everyone to utilize. The second part, I would just say the interoperability. This is a huge issue, just when it comes to digital transformation more broadly. And this can be tough because I think you can get into a process of digital transformation, which without necessarily thinking down the future, is this going to be interoperable with different agencies and different data sets? And that can be a challenge. We were just actually together in the region talking about interoperability and sharing of data when it came to political financing. And I would say we have to think through here, not just national systems to give, for example, corruption prevention agencies the data they need from different agencies to be able to sort of cross-check funding and spending issues. But we need to maybe think about the transnational issues here, particularly when it comes to foreign money coming into electoral processes. And is there a need for national agencies to be able to access information about funding flows perhaps that are coming from outside the country? So I think it's a critical issue and great question that was raised.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And I do agree that there are many issues to take into account there. One, of course, is the issue of data privacy. So, I mean, in the European context, we have GDPR, for example, to consider how can we provide this access to data without interfering with the data privacy regulations that are rightly in place. How can a system provide red flags, even if the users don't necessarily have access to all the data directly? Vladislav, please, what's your thought on this?
I would just need to add up a few things, and it's important to understand that sometimes this buzzword or this process of interoperation is taken into account as a magical wand which will solve all your problems. And in reality, this is usually never the case. And it's important that you need to really plan ahead, mainly because these systems are difficult and they need to interact between themselves. But you also need to be aware about the technology. technology changes faster than systems are evolving. So choosing the right concept of this interop is what is important in order to have this running long term and not to be, you know, the magic word everyone will use in every institution, and they don't do in reality a lot about it. They will say, we'll let this interop do the job, and in reality they are not thinking clear into the development process of their systems for the future. And then this interop is actually starting to be the stopper, the problem of interagency or even wider communication between systems, because it's not based on technology or in concepts which take into account data privacy, data security, data integrity, and this is why it's important to have it analyzed properly.
Thank you very much, Vladislav. I want to move on to another question, specifically for Hannes in this case. And the question is, and I'll read it out again, you mentioned in the dialogue the situation in Ukraine and also the situation in Estonia. What would you say is the general situation in Europe? I realize this is not entirely easy to answer. The situation in Europe in using digital transformation against corruption.
Yeah, thank you. I think the situation varies country by country, and most of the countries are doing remarkable progress. So I think what we need to consider also is that in some countries where the paper-based administrative services are working so fluently that no one is eager to change them, maybe except the citizens who want to go online, but the government is thinking in many countries that it's still efficient and professional. I think we need to take it like country by country, but I think in general there is a high demand from the citizens and businesses to move digital in all possible services, because no one is willing actually to visit the government offices or send the paperwork. I can bring you one sample from one European country where you can do all paperwork online. When you are getting all this paperwork from the government in paper format to your home, in your home mail address, when you sign it and when you put it to a prepaid envelope and send it back to the government. So it's I cannot say it's not efficient, but it's not full cycle. The full cycle of online services is that you can fulfill it finally, fill the application, sign it, pay if needed, and submit it to the government, and if possible, get the immediate automated response also. So I think people are very eager to get those services in each and every country in Europe. And I think the obstacles are not technical. Obstacles are more like in the administrative thinking in some countries, what are federal countries. There is also that the data sharing is pretty complicated as there is no national databases rather than they are federal or even municipal. So how to connect them all, how to make it securely, how to also make it according to data protection principles. In some countries, data protection is killing everything, so because it's considered too heavily. So I don't want to blame any country, but I see that people are much more willing to get to use those services rather than governments who are eager to provide them. So there is a lot of room for improvement. And I think, again, Ukrainian case currently is like a really lighthouse for many governments, how to do it actually in the way how people want it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. And I'll move on to another question, which obviously for an organization such as the International Foundation for Electoral Systems is very crucial. And the question is, how can digitalization be deployed in tackling electoral corruption, such as vote buying and vote selling? And I want to tag on to that another question that came in, how these tools can be used to supervise things like the tabulation of election results, for instance, which of course also relates to electoral corruption. Who would like to pick up on that? Katherine.
Well, I can quickly start, but I think this is a whole webinar in itself. And I might start with the latter part of the question first, which is just supervising certain parts of the process. I would just say, going back to the principle of what digital transformation is for, And here again, I think you need to look at the problem set and the end user. So I think there can be a trend to, again, digitize everything where it may not be needed, or it may have sort of a detrimental effect. But I think in instances where, for example, there might be a benefit in having a different type of transparency, efficiency around a process, careful introduction of technology, such as in the results tabulation process, can be really important. But certainly how you do it and how people can observe and access the process of digital transformation is really important. And again, I think constant focus on the end user, the new risks that it might introduce, and the purpose of why we're doing it is very important in elections. And then on the first question about corruption in elections, again, I think we have to look at the type of corruption and how it is carried out. So vote buying, for example, could be done differently in different contexts, where it might just be someone handing out cash, let's say, around a polling place. I think that's a different issue, right, that digital transformation may not be able to assist with. However, if it's more related to corrupt influence, perhaps, in the electoral process, then certainly, you know, data around political financing could be important. And you know, I had one nugget in my mind with the news cycle at the moment in the US focused on the tragic gun violence in Texas. And there's been some interesting reporting about then donations from, let's say, the National Rifle Association, you know, to certain political actors. So that gets at the value of data analytics and the value of transparency in the sense of the reporting that we have around political financing. So finally, I'd say on that, in terms of corruption in the electoral process, it comes back to that interoperability issue, because you often have a number of different institutions that might have a role to play in tackling electoral corruption, because it might, for example, come under, let's say, like in Ukraine, the NACP might have an administrative mandate to deal with electoral corruption, but at the same time, perhaps something like vote buying might also be a criminal offence. So the ability for institutions across the administrative and criminal spheres to be able to interact and share data, I think, is one benefit that I could see in terms of tackling electoral corruption.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Does anyone else want to pick up on this issue? So let me round off then with a very easy question, effectively questioning if we should have this online discussion at all. And I'd really like to hear everyone's, all the panelists' opinion of this. The question is, does using digital tools really address corruption? Or is it just a way of hiding the dirty truth with fancy new names and approaches? Hannes, please.
Yeah, thank you for a great question, whoever submitted it. But I think the key question is not the digital or not digital, tools or not tools. It's the willingness of a government actually to reduce the corruption or eliminate the corruption. And if you want to eliminate it, those digital tools are very good, because they are eliminating a lot of face-to-face processes and making government transparent and efficient. If you don't want to do it, you can definitely say that we are doing everything, but nothing is happening. So it's not about digital transformation itself. It's about willingness of a government either to do it or not to do it. Full stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Who would like to pick up on that? Oleksandr, please.
I would probably a little bit disagree, because I think that even if government doesn't want to reduce the corruption, the IT tools definitely reduce it. At least in my practice with the public procurement system. First of all, the corruption remains, but it becomes more complex. You should be smarter to corrupt the system, to corrupt the official. And I agree that this is probably never-ending story, and you won't be able to eliminate it totally. But the more complex is a corruption, the more complex is for all these crooks to crack the system and to corrupt anyone. So I believe that digital tools definitely make the life of corruption people harder.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. Two different perspectives there, at least to some extent. Very happy to organize another online discussion specifically on that issue. Katherine?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And I think no one on this webinar would say that, you know, digital transformation is a panacea and is going to get rid of all corruption. However, I think now, after several years, there are good evidence and good studies, as Oleksandr said, that prove that it really can reduce certain types of corruption. So I think there's real evidence behind the suggestion that it's a good tactic. And I would say I use tactic deliberately. It's just one tool in, I guess, the toolkit of trying to tackle corruption. I would say, for example, you know, these sanctions we've seen against Russian oligarchs and some of the assets that have been frozen. I think there's, you know, without the sort of digital processes and the data available, I think that could have been a lot more difficult. The one other thing I'd say, and it gets, I think, to Hans' point, is this is about transformation. And in many respects, it's about changing the relationship between government and citizens or individuals. And part of that is not just a digital technology, that's just one structure for doing so. It requires that much broader transformation in institutions and maybe politics or political landscape in a country. I think those two different parts have to go together.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And the final word goes to Vladislav, please.
Well, we already heard the
Vladislav, sir, let's go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So we heard the process of how these tools can help. When no matter how you use the tools, there is one benefit in using tools in the digital tools, and every tool provides a level of openness. And this is why it's actually powerful in order to combat this process. Paper doesn't provide openness, and even if tools are more difficult or more easy to use, they provide some level of openness, and this is why they're changing the way people communicate, the citizens communicate with the government and vice versa. Sometimes it will take a few iterations in order to get the right tool, to get the right level of openness, but still it's there, and digital information is more open than any other form of information, and this is why it's important.
Thank you very much, Vladislav. So I think in the end, we have a partial consensus, at least. Digital transformation does not solve the issues with corruption, but it is one important tool in the arsenal that we need to fight this major issue that challenges all our societies across Europe. We could continue this discussion for a very long time, but we have come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all our panelists for their input. I want to thank all of you for your participation. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this event and my IFES colleagues for the technical preparations and the management. So the next installment in this discussion series will be held on June the 30th. That's the Thursday, about a month from now. That will be the 20th installment in our discussion series. We'll celebrate by organizing a hybrid event with panelists and audience online, just like you now, combined with panelists and an audience with us in a room here in Prague. The focus of that event will be on foreign influence over democratic institutions and processes in Europe, obviously a key issue for us to discuss at this particular point in time. I hope to see you all in that discussion, and until then, stay safe.